How in the world did a widely used, perfectly legal medicinal herb become the foundation for a whole century of systemic inequity? Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving straight into the hard sociological data to see exactly how century-old policies built these massive structural barriers that are, remarkably, still standing today. We're going to unpack the underlying architecture of cannabis prohibition, exploring not just how it was built, but what researchers say is fundamentally required to tear it down and rebuild something equitable in its place. To really grasp the core paradox of the source material we're looking at today, we've got to start with a massive cultural shift: 88%. That is the number of U.S. adults who now believe cannabis should be legal in some form. Just think about the sheer scale of that for a second. In today's highly polarized world, almost nothing gets 88% agreement. That is an absolute, undeniable transformation in public sentiment. But here is the profound friction at the center of all this. The criminal justice system really hasn't caught up to that 88%.
And that brings us to a staggering contradiction, because despite legalization absolutely sweeping the nation and state-level commercial markets just booming, millions of people from historically marginalized communities are still trapped. Sociologists refer to these as permanent, invisible sentences. We literally have a booming legal market on one side and indefinite punishment on the other. So here is our blueprint for today. We're covering 1. The Manufactured Prohibition Crisis, 2. The systemic bias filter, 3. The anatomy of invisible sentences, 4. Hypocritical commercial economic friction, and finally, 5. The blueprint for restorative reform.
Section 1, the Manufactured Prohibition Crisis, or building a flawed foundation. To figure out why the criminal justice system is so far behind public opinion, we have to look back at how this whole architecture was built in the first place.
Because before any of these bans hit, cannabis was just a widely recognized medicinal herb you could buy in American pharmacies. What's absolutely fascinating is that the origins of prohibition don't trace back to some enlightened medical consensus. No. They trace back to bureaucratic self-preservation, starting right around 1933. You see, when alcohol prohibition ended, federal law enforcement had the agents, they had the budgets, but suddenly, they didn't have a crisis. They desperately needed a new target to justify their existence.
Enter Federal Bureau of Narcotics Commissioner Harry Anslinger. The historical records show he needed a crisis, so well, he simply engineered one. Using sensationalism and yellow journalism, he fabricated narratives connecting this historically legal herb to violent crime. He deliberately constructed a racialized threat specifically targeting Black and Mexican men with completely unfounded, highly publicized claims. It was a cynically brilliant manufactured crisis that successfully pushed through the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937.
In that politically motivated foundation, it eventually hardened into a total federal law by 1970, when cannabis was classified as a Schedule I substance, literally putting it in the exact same legal category as heroin. That rigid framework completely ignored prior medical applications and held incredibly tight for decades. It wasn't until 1996, with California's Proposition 215, that this monolithic federal law finally started to fracture at the state level, kicking off the shifts we see today.
Moving on to Section 2, the systemic bias filter, equal inputs, disproportionate outcomes. As we step into the modern era, we really need to inspect the structural walls that this deeply flawed history continues to support today. Because even as state laws began to change, the war on drugs carried that initial systemic bias right along with it. Empirical research points out a really jarring contrast in the sociological data. The inputs, meaning the actual human behaviors regarding consumption, are practically identical across Black, Hispanic, and white demographics. People were and are consuming at the exact same rates. But the legal outcomes, they are drastically disproportionate, with vastly higher rates of arrest, conviction, and incarceration concentrated squarely in marginalized communities. The sources make it clear that the law was never enforced neutrally. Instead, it operated through what sociologists call hyper-surveillance. Basically, police aggressively targeted specific neighborhoods. This creates a systemic bias filter, taking perfectly equal behavior, running it through a localized, heavily scrutinized funnel, and spitting out devastating criminal penalties for actions that were happening completely consequence-free just across town. Section 3, Anatomy of Invisible Sentences, the Permanent Punishment. We all know the old American saying, do the crime, do the time, right? It implies you get a clean slate once your sentence is done. But the sociological data tells a much longer, far more persistent story. A criminal conviction for simple possession actually transforms into a permanent, invisible brick wall.
It actively blocks marginalized individuals from the most basic human needs, finding stable housing, getting a reliable job, and accessing higher education. It systematically strips away a person's ability to be an independent provider, legally locking them into a state of structural dependency way after their debt to society is supposedly paid. Just think about the sheer scale of this for a second. Approximately 90% of modern American employers use formal pre-employment background checks. 90%. That turns a minor, maybe decades-old offense into a literal lifetime economic blockade. And this doesn't just hurt one individual, it depresses the earning potential of entire families and neighborhoods, significantly widening the racial wealth gap generation after generation. Which leads us to Section 4, hypocritical commercial economic friction. This permanent punishment creates a glaring paradox in today's commercial landscape. When a state simply legalizes cannabis moving forward without actively addressing the damage of the past, we end up with a fundamentally uneven playing field. The sources impartially point out a massive structural hypocrisy here. On one side, corporate operators are pulling in billions of dollars in fully legal, celebrated profits. But on the other side, systemic victims with past convictions for possessing that exact same substance remain legally locked out. They can't participate, they can't invest, they often can't even get an entry-level job in that very same booming market. And it's not just about being economically locked out. Decades of aggressive policing based on this flawed foundation have created a cycle that severely damages community trust, which, ironically, actively harms public safety for everyone. When a community sees laws being selectively enforced based on racial biases, a deep institutional cynicism sets in. People become much less likely to report violent crimes or cooperate with investigations. It proves that just passing new commercial statutes doesn't automatically erase ingrained destructive historical practices. Finally, Section 5, Blueprint for Restorative Reform, Demolition and Rebuilding. So how do we actually fix this? How do we transition from a century of retributional punishment to true social equity? Researchers are very clear on this. Tearing down this architecture requires a highly specific restorative policy, automatic retroactive expungement. That is the mandatory, system-initiated clearance of past criminal records. Sociologists argue this isn't just some optional, nice-to-have policy preference. It is an absolute fundamental necessity to repair historical systemic damage. Think of this policy like a heavy-duty pair of bolt cutters. The data shows this is the exact mechanical intervention needed to officially sever the chain connecting a racially biased historical offense to a lifetime of economic disenfranchisement. And the word automatic is absolutely crucial here. It shifts the burden away from the individual, who often can't afford expensive legal fees, and puts the responsibility of clearing the records squarely back onto the system that created the inequity in the first place. This shift is monumental. It takes us from passive legalization, which just means we stop arresting people tomorrow but leave the artificial barriers intact for those arrested yesterday, to true restorative action. Restorative action actively clears those records, knocks down the lifelong economic barriers, and works to genuinely rebuild institutional trust and stabilize fractured communities. Synthesizing everything the sources have covered, the complete blueprint for true social equity really requires 3 vital pillars. You need commercial legalization to end ongoing criminalization. You need community reinvestment to heal local economies. And right there in the center, the missing middle piece holding the whole shebang together, you need automatic expungement to actively clear out those artificial, racially biased barriers of the past. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought directly from the source text. Based on all the data, the calculated history of Anslinger's original strategy, and the crippling weight of those invisible sentences we just unpacked, can true legality truly exist if we don't clear the systemic injustices of the past? It's a question that challenges every single one of us to look far beyond just consumer markets, to what real, lasting justice actually requires. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.